I thought I knew what family meant until my sister Delphine looked me straight in the eye at our grandmother's funeral reception and said those words that would change everything. The mahogany dining table that had hosted every major family gathering for 30 years suddenly became a battleground, and I was apparently the enemy. But as I stepped back from that table watching my relatives feast on lies as much as casseroles, I realized something they had not counted on. Sometimes the person you cast out is the only one who has been paying attention. Sometimes the outsider sees what the insiders have been hiding. And sometimes blood is not thicker than betrayal. Before we dive into this family drama that exposed decades of deception, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button if family loyalty has ever been tested in your life, and make sure to subscribe, because this story of revenge and justice will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about blood ties. The funeral reception was supposed to be a celebration of Grandma Rose's life, but it turned into the moment I discovered my family's true nature. As the youngest daughter in the prestigious Blackwood family, I had always felt like an outsider, but I attributed it to being 8 years younger than my sister Delphine and 6 years younger than my brother Marcus. What I did not realize was that my exclusion was deliberate and calculated. When Delphine made that comment about the family table, I initially thought it was just grief talking. Our grandmother had passed away after a long battle with dementia, and emotions were running high. But then I noticed the subtle exchanges of glances, the way conversations stopped when I approached, and the protective way my siblings and parents huddled around certain documents that our family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, had brought. My first real clue came when I overheard my mother, Patricia, whispering urgently to Delphine in the kitchen. "She cannot know about the trust modifications," my mother said, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes. Rose may have been losing her mind, but she was still sharp enough to change her will. "We need to make sure the original documents are the only ones that surface." Trust modifications, will changes. These were not normal funeral day conversations. I pretended to be arranging flowers while straining to hear more, but they moved their conversation to the study. However, I had heard enough to plant a seed of suspicion that would grow into a full investigation. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, I volunteered to help clean up. This gave me access to various rooms in the family home, including Grandma Rose's old bedroom, which my parents had been systematically clearing out over the past few weeks. As I folded clothes and packed books, I discovered something that made my blood run cold: a hidden compartment in her antique secretary desk. Inside were multiple versions of what appeared to be legal documents, some bearing recent dates. There were bank statements showing transfers I had never heard discussed, property deeds that seemed to have been altered, and most shocking of all, handwritten notes in my grandmother's distinctive script, expressing concerns about Patricia and James manipulating the children against Serafina, and ensuring my youngest granddaughter receives her fair inheritance despite their interference. The financial documents painted a disturbing picture. Over the past 5 years, my parents had systematically moved assets from my grandmother's accounts into various family trusts and business entities that I was not named in. Meanwhile, they had positioned themselves as Grandma Rose's primary caregivers and financial managers, claiming that her dementia made independent decision-making impossible. But the dates on some of these documents preceded any official dementia diagnosis by 2 years. More troubling, there were medical records showing that my grandmother had specifically requested second opinions about her cognitive state, expressing suspicions that her prescribed medications were affecting her mental clarity. These requests had been dismissed by Dr. Morrison, who happened to be my father's longtime golf partner. The pattern became clearer as I dug deeper. Every family gathering I had been excluded from, every adults-only conversation I had been shut out of, and every financial decision made in Grandma Rose's best interest had actually been steps in a carefully orchestrated plan to isolate our grandmother from outside influence while systematically redistributing her wealth. My parents, James and Patricia, had been embezzling from her accounts under the guise of investment management. My siblings had been complicit accepting generous gifts and trust fund contributions that should have been split 4 ways instead of 3. The family business Blackwood and Associates Real Estate Development had purchased several of my grandmother's properties at significantly below market value, claiming they were helping her liquidate assets for care expenses. The most devastating discovery was a series of forged documents bearing my grandmother's signature authorizing these transactions. Comparing them to her genuine signature on older documents, the forgeries were obvious to anyone who looked closely. But who would question the loving family managing an elderly woman's affairs? As I sat in that bedroom surrounded by evidence of betrayal, I finally understood why I had always felt like an outsider. It was not personality differences or age gaps that had excluded me from family decisions. It was greed, pure and simple. My family had deliberately cultivated my alienation to ensure I would not question their activities or advocate for my grandmother's true wishes. The cruelest irony was that Grandma Rose had apparently tried to protect me in her final years. Several of the hidden documents indicated that she had been attempting to revise her will to ensure I received an equal share of her estate despite my family's manipulation. She had even consulted with a different attorney, Margaret Sullivan, about changing her medical and financial power of attorney arrangements. But every attempt at independence had been thwarted. Appointments with Ms. Sullivan had been cancelled by my parents, claiming my grandmother was having a bad day. Phone calls from outside attorneys had been intercepted. Even visits from social services, apparently prompted by my grandmother's own requests for wellness checks, had been managed and manipulated to present a picture of a loving family caring for a declining matriarch. Standing in that room holding evidence of years of financial abuse and emotional manipulation, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion I had carried for so long crystallized into something much more powerful: determination. My family thought they had successfully isolated and marginalized me, making me irrelevant to their schemes. But they had made a crucial error in judgment. By pushing me away, they had freed me to see their actions with clear eyes. And by underestimating me, they had given me the perfect position to expose their crimes. I carefully photographed every document with my phone, ensuring I captured all the details that would matter to investigators. Then I returned everything to exactly where I had found it, making sure no one would suspect I had discovered their secret. As I rejoined the family in the living room, accepting their hollow condolences and fake expressions of grief, I was already formulating my plan. They wanted to exclude me from the family table. Perfect. I would build my own table, and when the time came for judgment, there would be plenty of room for justice. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had never experienced before. While my family slept off their grief performance from the funeral reception, I was already 3 steps ahead planning their downfall. The evidence I had gathered was explosive, but I needed to be strategic about how I used it. This was not just about money. This was about justice for my grandmother and accountability for years of deception. My first call was to Margaret Sullivan, the attorney my grandmother had tried to consult. When I explained who I was and what I had discovered, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Serafina," she said carefully, "your grandmother tried to reach out to me several times over the past 2 years. Every appointment was canceled, usually by your parents claiming she was too confused to make legal decisions. I suspected something was wrong, but without direct access to your grandmother, my hands were tied." Sullivan agreed to meet me that afternoon, away from any family properties. I brought copies of all the documents I had photographed, and her reaction confirmed my worst fears. "This is systematic financial elder abuse," she said, her voice tight with anger. "These forged signatures alone constitute multiple felonies, but the manipulation of her medical care to maintain control, that is criminal on a level that goes far beyond money." Together, we began building a case that would expose not just the financial crimes, but the entire web of deceit my family had constructed. Ms. Sullivan had retained records of every canceled appointment and every intercepted communication attempt, creating a paper trail that demonstrated my grandmother's thwarted efforts to regain control of her affairs. But I wanted more than just legal consequences. I wanted my family to experience the same isolation and betrayal they had inflicted on my grandmother and me. So I began reaching out to extended family members, cousins, and great aunts, who had always wondered why they saw so little of Grandma Rose in her final years. The conversation with my cousin Rebecca was particularly revealing. I tried to visit Aunt Rose at least a dozen times over the past 3 years, she told me. But Patricia always had an excuse. Rose was sleeping or having a bad day or had just taken medication. I started to feel like I was being deliberately kept away, but I thought maybe I was being paranoid. Rebecca was not being paranoid, and neither were the other family members who had been systematically excluded from my grandmother's life. Uncle Thomas had tried to invite her to his 60th birthday celebration, only to be told she was too frail to travel. Cousin Janet had attempted to organize a family reunion, but my parents had insisted that large gatherings would be too overwhelming for my grandmother's condition. Each conversation revealed another piece of the isolation strategy my parents had employed. They had positioned themselves as the sole gatekeepers to my grandmother, controlling every interaction and managing every narrative. Anyone who might have questioned their decisions, or advocated for different care arrangements, had been gently but firmly pushed aside. Armed with this information, I scheduled a family meeting for the following Saturday. I told my parents and siblings that I wanted to discuss my grandmother's memorial arrangements and my role in handling her personal effects. What they did not know was that I had also invited Ms. Sullivan, several excluded family members, and a representative from Adult Protective Services. The meeting location was deliberately chosen, the conference room at Blackwood and Associates, my family's real estate office. This was their territory, their seat of power where they felt most comfortable and confident. It was also where I planned to destroy their world. My family arrived expecting another opportunity to manage and manipulate me. My father James had prepared a folder of documents that he presented as Grandma Rose's final wishes regarding her estate. My mother Patricia had brought a box of what she claimed were sentimental items that my grandmother had specifically requested I receive as my inheritance. My siblings, Delphine and Marcus, flanked them like bodyguards ready to support whatever narrative my parents presented. Serafina, my father began in his practiced patriarchal tone. We know losing Grandma Rose has been difficult for all of us, but we need to move forward with settling her affairs in a way that honors her wishes and maintains family unity. I let him continue for several minutes, laying out their fabricated version of events. According to their story, my grandmother had been increasingly confused in her final years, relying heavily on their guidance for all major decisions. The estate distribution reflected her desire to provide for those who had shouldered the burden of her care while ensuring I received meaningful mementos that reflected our special relationship. When my father finished his presentation, I simply said, "That is an interesting interpretation of events. However, I think we should get some additional perspectives before moving forward." The conference room door opened, and Ms. Sullivan entered, followed by Rebecca, Uncle Thomas, and Janet. My family's faces went through a fascinating range of emotions, surprise, confusion, and then dawning alarm as they realized they had lost control of the narrative. "Ms. Sullivan," I said formally, "would you please share with my family what you discovered when you reviewed the documents I provided?" Ms. Sullivan's presentation was methodical and devastating. She laid out the evidence of forged signatures, unauthorized asset transfers, and manipulated medical records with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. She explained how my grandmother's attempts to seek independent legal counsel had been systematically thwarted, and how her efforts to maintain relationships with extended family had been deliberately sabotaged. But the moment that truly broke my family was when Ms. Sullivan read from my grandmother's handwritten notes discovered in her secret compartment. "I fear my own children are stealing from me, while convincing everyone, including myself, sometimes that I am losing my mind. Serafina is the only one who visits me without wanting something. She listens to my stories without checking her watch, and she never talks about my money or my properties. I need to find a way to protect her from what the others are planning." The room fell silent as the full scope of their betrayal became clear. My grandmother had not been a confused old woman who needed protection from bad decisions. She had been a sharp, aware person who had recognized exactly what was happening to her, but had been powerless to stop it. My father attempted damage control. These are the confused ramblings of a woman suffering from dementia. You cannot take these notes as evidence of anything concrete. That was when I played my final card. Actually, Dad, we can. Because I also found the medical records showing that Grandma Rose had specifically requested cognitive assessments from independent physicians, all of which were blocked or canceled by you and Mom. I found the records of her communications with social services reporting concerns about financial manipulation. And I found the real estate documents showing how you purchased her properties for a fraction of their actual value, while she was supposedly too confused to make financial decisions. The silence that followed was deafening. My family sat frozen, realizing that their carefully constructed facade had not just cracked, but completely shattered. Years of manipulation and lies lay exposed on the conference table, documented and verified by professionals who could not be dismissed or manipulated. Uncle Thomas was the first to speak. "James," he said quietly, "how could you do this to your own mother? How could you steal from her while pretending to care for her?" My father's response revealed everything about his character. Instead of remorse or shame, he showed only anger at being caught. "You people do not understand what it was like dealing with her every day. The constant demands, the paranoia, the accusations. We sacrificed our lives to take care of her, and we deserve compensation for that sacrifice." It was exactly the wrong thing to say in front of witnesses who would later testify about my family's attitude toward my grandmother's welfare. But it was also exactly what I needed to hear to know that I had made the right choice in exposing their crimes. The meeting ended with my parents and siblings storming out, but not before Ms. Sullivan served them with official notice that the estate was being frozen pending investigation and that all transfers of assets over the past 5 years would be scrutinized by both civil and criminal authorities. As I sat in that conference room, surrounded by family members who had been excluded and manipulated just as I had been, I felt something I had never experienced before: the power of truth. For the first time in my life, I was not the outsider looking in. I was the one who had seen clearly, acted decisively, and brought justice to light. The war was far from over, but the first battle had been won decisively. My family had underestimated me for the last time. The weeks following the conference room confrontation transformed my life in ways I could never have anticipated. While my parents and siblings scrambled to contain the legal fallout from their exposed crimes, I found myself at the center of a growing coalition of people who had been wronged by the Blackwood family's manipulations. The first unexpected ally emerged just 3 days after the meeting. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been my grandmother's primary care physician before my parents switched her to their golf buddy, Dr. Morrison, contacted me through Miss Sullivan's office. Her message was brief, but powerful. "I need to speak with you about your grandmother's medical care. There are things I documented that I believe you should know." Meeting Dr. Martinez in her office felt like stepping into another world of deception I had not even known existed. She pulled out a thick file labeled Rose Blackwood, Concerns and Documentation, and began laying out a medical conspiracy that rivaled the financial crimes in its scope and cruelty. "Your grandmother came to me in early 2021, expressing concerns that her medication was making her feel confused and disoriented," Dr. Martinez explained. "When I reviewed her prescriptions, I found she was being given a combination of drugs that would absolutely cause cognitive impairment in someone her age. When I questioned the prescribing physician, Dr. Morrison claimed the medications were necessary for anxiety and sleep issues. But Grandma Rose had never complained of anxiety or sleep problems during her decades-long relationship with Dr. Martinez. More disturbing, when Dr. Martinez had attempted to contact my parents about adjusting the medication regimen, they had insisted that any changes needed to go through Dr. Morrison, effectively cutting her out of my grandmother's care entirely. I kept detailed notes because something felt wrong. Dr. Martinez continued. Your grandmother was lucid and articulate when discussing her concerns about her family's behavior, but then she would become confused and disoriented after taking her evening medications. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. She handed me copies of her medical notes, which painted a horrifying picture of pharmaceutical manipulation designed to create the very symptoms my parents had used to justify their control over my grandmother's life. The medications Dr. Morrison had prescribed were not just unnecessary, they were contraindicated for someone my grandmother's age and could have contributed to her eventual cognitive decline. I reported my concerns to the medical board. Dr. Martinez said, "But Dr. Morrison is well connected and without direct access to your grandmother to document the effects of medication changes, my hands were tied. However, all of my reports are on file, and they establish a timeline that supports everything you have discovered." This medical evidence transformed our case from financial elder abuse into something much more serious, a deliberate conspiracy to incapacitate my grandmother through pharmaceutical manipulation while systematically looting her estate. Ms. Sullivan immediately contacted the district attorney's office, and within a week, we had the attention of Detective Raymond Walsh, who specialized in elder abuse cases. Detective Walsh brought a level of investigative power that I had not expected. Within days of reviewing our evidence, he had obtained search warrants for my parents' financial records, my siblings' bank accounts, and the business records of Blackwood and Associates. What he discovered exceeded even my worst suspicions. The financial investigation revealed that the embezzlement had been going on for over 7 years, beginning shortly after my grandfather's death, when my grandmother had inherited his substantial life insurance policy. My parents had systematically identified and exploited every vulnerable moment in my grandmother's life, using major life changes and health scares as opportunities to gain greater control over her affairs. But Detective Walsh's most significant contribution was connecting our case to a broader pattern of elder abuse that had been occurring across the county. Dr. Morrison, it turned out, had been involved in similar medication manipulation schemes with at least 4 other elderly patients, all of whom had seen their assets mysteriously transferred to family members who claimed to be providing care for their declining relatives. This revelation brought in federal investigators, transforming our family drama into a major criminal investigation that made the local news. Suddenly, the Blackwood name was not associated with successful real estate development, but with elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The impact on my family's business and social standing was immediate and devastating. My siblings' responses to the expanding investigation revealed their true characters in ways that both surprised and saddened me. Marcus, who had always been the aggressive one, attempted to intimidate witnesses and even made veiled threats against me through mutual acquaintances. Delphine, the sister who had excluded me from the family table, tried a different approach: manipulation and victim playing. Delphine's campaign to win back family sympathy was particularly insidious. She began calling relatives with sob stories about how I was destroying the family over money and how my jealousy had driven me to fabricate evidence against my loving parents. She painted herself as the reasonable middle child trying to hold the family together while I pursued my vindictive agenda. What Delphine did not realize was that several of these relatives had already spoken with Detective Walsh and knew exactly what evidence existed against our parents. Her manipulation attempts only served to demonstrate her complicity in the cover-up and her willingness to continue lying even when faced with overwhelming evidence. The turning point came when my cousin Rebecca decided to take a more active role in supporting the investigation. As a certified public accountant, she volunteered to analyze the financial documents that had been seized, bringing professional expertise that helped investigators understand the full scope of the embezzlement scheme. Rebecca's analysis revealed sophisticated financial manipulation that went far beyond simple theft. My parents had created a complex web of shell companies, fake contracts, and inflated service charges designed to transfer my grandmother's wealth into vehicles they controlled, while maintaining plausible deniability about the transactions. This was not opportunistic theft, Rebecca explained to me over coffee one afternoon. This was a professionally planned and executed scheme that required years of preparation and coordination. Your parents studied your grandmother's finances like they were planning a heist, identifying every asset and designing specific methods to acquire each one. More family members began coming forward as news of the investigation spread. Great Aunt Eleanor revealed that my parents had approached her years earlier, suggesting she might want to simplify her own estate planning by working with their family financial advisor. When she had declined invitations to family gatherings had mysteriously stopped coming. Cousin David shared that he had attempted to borrow money for his daughter's college tuition, knowing that Grandma Rose had always been generous with educational expenses for the grandchildren. But when he had approached her, my parents had intercepted the conversation, claiming she could no longer afford such gifts due to her care expenses. Meanwhile, Marcus had purchased a new luxury car that same month, supposedly funded by his business success. Each new revelation added another layer to the conspiracy and brought another ally to our cause. What had started as my solitary quest for justice had evolved into a family-wide reckoning with decades of manipulation and abuse. The isolation tactics my parents had used to control my grandmother had created a network of wronged family members who were now united in their determination to see justice served. The media attention also brought unexpected support from outside the family. Elder rights advocates reached out to offer assistance with the legal case. Other families who had experienced similar abuse shared their stories and strategies. Financial investigators volunteered their expertise to help untangle the complex web of transactions my parents had created. But the most meaningful alliance came from an unexpected source, my grandmother's longtime housekeeper, Maria Santos, who had been quietly documenting concerning behavior for years. Maria had kept detailed journals of my parents' visits, noting when they would arrive with papers for my grandmother to sign, and how confused my grandmother would seem after their departures. "Your grandmother, she was a smart lady," Maria told me through tears. "But after your parents' visits, she would ask me the same questions over and over, like she could not remember what she had agreed to. She would say to me, 'Maria, I think I signed something important, but I cannot remember what it was.'" It broke my heart to see her so worried. Maria's journals provided crucial evidence about the timeline of my grandmother's cognitive decline and its correlation with my parents' increased involvement in her affairs. More importantly, her testimony would carry significant weight with investigators because she had no financial interest in the outcome of the case. As spring turned into summer, our coalition had grown from a handful of concerned family members into a formidable force for justice. We had medical professionals documenting pharmaceutical manipulation, financial experts analyzing complex fraud schemes, law enforcement agencies coordinating multiple investigations, and family members providing decades of context about suspicious behavior. My parents and siblings, meanwhile, had become increasingly isolated as their lies unraveled and their manipulation tactics stopped working. The very strategies they had used to control my grandmother and exclude me from family decisions were now working against them as they found themselves cut off from the support and sympathy they had always taken for granted. Standing in the courthouse after yet another hearing, where new charges were filed against my parents, I realized that the family table I had been excluded from no longer existed. In its place, we were building something entirely different, a community based on truth, accountability, and genuine care for one another, rather than manipulation and exploitation. But even as our case grew stronger and our coalition grew larger, I could not shake the feeling that the most challenging phase of this battle was still ahead of us. My family had built their empire on lies and manipulation for years, and they would not surrender it without a fight that would test every alliance we had built. Just as our coalition seemed unbreakable, and victory appeared within reach, the most devastating betrayal came from the person I had trusted most, my cousin Rebecca. The woman who had analyzed our financial evidence and helped build our case had been playing both sides from the beginning. The revelation came during what was supposed to be a routine strategy meeting with Detective Walsh and Ms. Sullivan. We were preparing for the grand jury hearings when Detective Walsh received an urgent call that changed everything. Critical evidence had disappeared from the police evidence locker, and several key witnesses had suddenly recanted their statements. Someone with insider knowledge has been feeding information to your parents, Detective Walsh told us grimly. They knew exactly which evidence to target and which witnesses to pressure. This level of precision suggests someone close to our investigation has been compromising our efforts. The security footage from the police station revealed the shocking truth. Rebecca had used her access as a consulting expert to photograph evidence files and copy witness statements. Worse, phone records showed she had been in regular contact with my parents throughout the entire investigation, updating them on every development in our case. When confronted, Rebecca did not deny her betrayal. Instead, she justified it with cold calculation. Serafina, you were never going to win this fight, she said without a trace of remorse. Your parents offered me a partnership in their real estate development company and a share of the recovered assets. Why would I choose loyalty to you over financial security for my family? The scope of Rebecca's sabotage became clear as we assessed the damage. She had not only stolen evidence, but had also been manipulating our strategy meetings to benefit my parents' defense. Legal motions we had planned were suddenly anticipated by their attorneys. Witnesses we thought were secure had been contacted and intimidated. Financial documents we believed were safely protected had been analyzed by my parents' team before we could fully understand their implications. Most devastating of all, Rebecca had been feeding my parents information about my grandmother's hidden journals and medical records, allowing them to craft counter-narratives that explained away the most damning evidence. Dr. Morrison suddenly produced additional medical notes that supported his treatment decisions. My parents' attorney filed motions claiming my grandmother's journals were the confused writings of a woman whose medication-induced dementia made her unable to distinguish reality from paranoid fantasies. The legal momentum we had built over months evaporated in a matter of weeks. Charges against my parents were reduced from felony fraud to misdemeanor financial irregularities. Dr. Morrison faced only a medical board review rather than criminal prosecution. The estate, which had been frozen pending investigation, was released back to my parents' control under a temporary administration order that looked suspiciously permanent. My family's public relations campaign, now armed with insider information about our investigation's weaknesses, painted me as a bitter, jealous daughter who had fabricated evidence to steal her rightfully excluded inheritance. Local media, which had initially covered the case as a shocking example of elder abuse, began running stories questioning the reliability of our accusations. The isolation I thought I had escaped came flooding back with unprecedented intensity. Family members who had supported our cause began distancing themselves as my parents' version of events gained credibility. Uncle Thomas stopped returning my calls. Great-Aunt Eleanor publicly stated she had been misled about the true nature of the situation. Even Maria Santos, my grandmother's loyal housekeeper, was pressured into signing an affidavit claiming she had misunderstood many of the events she had previously reported. Sitting in Ms. Sullivan's office after yet another legal setback, I felt the full weight of defeat crushing down on me. They have systematically destroyed everything we built, I told her, struggling to keep my voice steady. Rebecca knew exactly how to dismantle our case because she helped us build it. How do we recover from this level of betrayal? Ms. Sullivan's response was not the comfort I expected. Serafina, this is not over. Yes, they have dealt us a significant blow, but they have also revealed something crucial about their methods. They are so confident in their victory that they are getting careless. And sometimes overconfidence creates the very opportunities we need to expose the truth. But in that moment, her optimism felt hollow against the reality of our situation. My parents had not just won, they had humiliated me publicly while securing their stolen wealth. My siblings had been vindicated in their exclusion of me from family decisions, proving to everyone that I was indeed the unstable outsider they had always claimed I was. The psychological warfare my family had unleashed was perhaps more effective than their legal maneuvering. They began a systematic campaign to make me question my own sanity and judgment. Anonymous letters arrived at my apartment, suggesting I seek mental health treatment for my delusions about family conspiracies. Former friends and colleagues received calls warning them that I was having a breakdown and spreading false accusations about my loving family. Most cruelly, they had Rebecca reach out to me with a fake reconciliation offer. She claimed to feel guilty about her betrayal and wanted to provide me with additional evidence that could salvage our case. Only Ms. Sullivan's insistence that I not meet with Rebecca alone prevented me from walking into what was obviously a trap designed to record me saying something that could be used to further discredit my mental state. As autumn arrived, I found myself more isolated than I had ever been, even during the years when I first suspected my family's betrayal. The difference was that now I knew exactly what I was fighting against, and the knowledge of their capabilities was almost paralyzing. They had not just stolen my grandmother's money, they had stolen my family, my reputation, and my sense of security in the world. Just when defeat seemed complete, and my family's victory appeared absolute salvation, arrived from the most unexpected source, my grandmother herself. 3 months after Rebecca's betrayal had seemingly destroyed our case, a package arrived at Ms. Sullivan's office that would change everything once again. The package came from a law firm in Seattle, with a note explaining that it had been held in their secure storage facility under instructions from Rose Blackwood to be delivered if my granddaughter Serafina ever needs proof of what really happened. Inside was a complete set of audio recordings my grandmother had made over the final 2 years of her life, documenting every conversation and incident that had raised her suspicions about her family's behavior. The recordings were devastating in their clarity and detail. My grandmother's voice, strong and lucid, described specific incidents of financial manipulation with dates, amounts, and direct quotes from conversations with my parents. She had secretly recorded several meetings where my parents had pressured her to sign documents capturing their use of emotional manipulation and outright deception to gain her compliance. "Today James brought papers for me to sign," my grandmother's voice said on one recording dated 18 months before her death. "He said it was just updating my emergency contact information, but I read the document after he left, and it was transferring ownership of my Lake Tahoe property to something called Blackwood Family Trust. When I called to ask him about it, he became angry and said I was being paranoid and ungrateful after everything he had done for me." But the most explosive evidence was a recording of my parents discussing their strategy for handling my grandmother's interference in their plans. In a conversation they thought was private, captured by a device my grandmother had hidden in her living room, they discussed increasing her medication to make her more manageable, and talked about the need to accelerate the timeline for transferring her remaining assets. "The old woman is getting suspicious," my father's voice said clearly on the recording. "Morrison says we can increase her anxiety medication, make her more confused, but we need to move faster on the remaining properties. If she gets lucid enough to call another lawyer, this whole thing falls apart." My mother's response was equally damning. "Serafina is the real problem. She is the only one who visits without wanting something, and Rose trusts her completely. We need to make sure Serafina does not have any opportunity to interfere with the final transfers." These recordings not only proved my grandmother's mental competency, but also demonstrated that my parents had been fully aware they were committing crimes against a lucid protesting victim. The pharmaceutical manipulation Dr. Martinez had suspected was confirmed by my parents' own words recorded in their unguarded moments. Miss Sullivan immediately contacted Detective Walsh, who had never fully closed his investigation, despite the setbacks caused by Rebecca's betrayal. The new evidence reinvigorated the criminal case and brought in additional federal investigators who specialized in organized fraud schemes. But our new alliance came from an even more powerful source: Margaret Chen, an investigative journalist from the state capital who had been tracking patterns of elder abuse across multiple counties. Margaret had been investigating Dr. Morrison independently and had uncovered evidence of similar schemes involving at least 12 elderly victims over the past decade. Margaret's investigation had revealed a sophisticated network of corrupt professionals who specialized in elder abuse. Dr. Morrison provided the medical cover for pharmaceutical manipulation. Certain attorneys facilitated questionable legal documents, and financial advisors helped families hide stolen assets in complex trust arrangements. My parents had been part of a much larger criminal enterprise than we had ever imagined. Your case is the key to bringing down this entire network, Margaret explained during our first meeting. You have documentation and recordings that prove the conspiracy, but more importantly, you have a victim who was smart enough to create an evidence trail that survives her death. Most elder abuse cases fail because the victims cannot testify and their family members control the narrative. Your grandmother made sure that would not happen here. Margaret's resources and connections transformed our position overnight. She had relationships with prosecutors, federal investigators, and elder rights organizations that could amplify our case far beyond the local level. Her newspaper was prepared to run a major exposé series that would bring national attention to the elder abuse network and pressure authorities to take decisive action. The investigation Margaret had been conducting also revealed the true extent of Rebecca's betrayal. She had not just been working with my parents. She had been connected to the broader criminal network, using her accounting expertise to help multiple families hide assets stolen from elderly relatives. Her betrayal of our case was not personal greed, but professional necessity to protect a much larger criminal operation. Armed with my grandmother's recordings and Margaret's broader investigation, Detective Walsh was able to secure new search warrants that uncovered evidence of crimes spanning multiple states and involving dozens of victims. Bank records showed systematic looting of elderly accounts. Medical records documented unnecessary pharmaceutical interventions designed to incapacitate patients, and communication records proved coordination between corrupt professionals across multiple jurisdictions. The scope of the criminal network also explained why my family had been so confident in their victory. They had not just been stealing from one confused old woman. They had been part of a system that had successfully victimized many families while avoiding serious legal consequences. Their overconfidence came from years of operating within a network that protected its members and discredited accusers. But my grandmother's foresight in creating and preserving evidence had given us something none of the other victims had possessed: undeniable proof of the criminals' methods and motivations. Her recordings captured not just individual crimes, but the systemic nature of the abuse network, providing prosecutors with evidence they could use to pursue conspiracy charges that carried much more serious penalties. The psychological impact of this revelation was as important as the legal implications. For months, I had questioned my own judgment and wondered if I was pursuing a vindictive campaign based on misunderstanding and jealousy. My grandmother's recordings proved that every suspicion had been justified and every accusation had been accurate. Listening to her voice describing the fear and helplessness she had experienced while being victimized by her own children was both heartbreaking and empowering. She had been isolated and manipulated, but she had never stopped fighting for justice. Her recordings were not just evidence, they were a final act of love and protection for the granddaughter she knew would continue the fight for truth. The final confrontation came not in a courtroom, but in the same conference room where I had first exposed my family's crimes 18 months earlier. This time, however, the power dynamic was completely reversed. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using my grandmother's recordings, and my parents faced decades in federal prison unless they agreed to cooperate with the broader investigation into the elder abuse network. My father, always the calculating businessman, was the first to break. Faced with evidence of his own voice planning criminal activities, he agreed to testify against Dr. Morrison and the other network participants in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation revealed the full scope of the operation, including detailed information about how families were recruited, how medical manipulation was coordinated, and how stolen assets were laundered through complex financial arrangements. My mother's response was more characteristic of her manipulative nature. Even when confronted with irrefutable evidence, she attempted to play the victim, claiming she had been coerced by my father and was too intimidated to resist his schemes. The recordings of her enthusiastic participation in planning their crimes made this defense laughable, but she maintained the pretense until the moment she signed her plea agreement. Delphine and Marcus, who had been so confident in their exclusion of me from family decisions, now faced their own criminal charges for money laundering and conspiracy. The gifts and trust fund contributions they had received were revealed to be proceeds from stolen assets, making them active participants in their parents' crimes rather than innocent beneficiaries. The plea negotiations revealed just how thoroughly my family had underestimated both my determination and my grandmother's preparation. They had assumed that discrediting me would end the investigation, never realizing that the most damaging evidence existed independently of my testimony. My grandmother's recordings could not be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a sick woman because they clearly demonstrated her mental acuity and detailed understanding of the crimes being committed against her. The financial recovery exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Federal asset forfeiture laws allowed prosecutors to seize not just my grandmother's stolen assets, but also the profits my family had earned by investing those assets over several years. Properties purchased with stolen money were sold, and the proceeds returned to my grandmother's estate. Business assets that had been enhanced with embezzled funds were liquidated to compensate victims. But the most satisfying justice came in the form of reputation destruction. Margaret's newspaper series had exposed my family's crimes to their entire social and business community. The Blackwood name, once associated with successful real estate development, became synonymous with elder abuse and family betrayal. Their business collapsed as clients fled and partners severed relationships, creating the same social isolation they had inflicted on my grandmother and me. Dr. Morrison faced the most serious consequences of anyone in the network. His deliberate pharmaceutical manipulation of elderly patients constituted aggravated assault in addition to conspiracy and fraud charges. The medical board stripped his license permanently, and he faced 15 years in federal prison. Several of his victims' families filed civil lawsuits that would ensure he remained financially devastated even after serving his sentence. Rebecca's betrayal ultimately worked against her when prosecutors offered her immunity in exchange for testimony about the broader network. Her detailed knowledge of the financial manipulation schemes made her invaluable as a witness, but it also revealed the extent of her criminal participation. She avoided prison time, but faced permanent disbarment and civil lawsuits from multiple victim families. The legal victory was comprehensive and satisfying, but the personal transformation was even more meaningful. The process of fighting for justice had connected me with people who shared my values of truth, accountability, and genuine care for vulnerable individuals. Margaret became not just a professional ally, but a close friend whose investigative work continued to protect other families from similar abuse. Ms. Sullivan, who had initially been hired as my attorney, evolved into a mentor who helped me understand how to use my experience to advocate for other elder abuse victims. Together, we established a foundation using part of my recovered inheritance to provide legal services for families facing similar situations. Dr. Martinez, whose original concerns about my grandmother's medical treatment had been vindicated, became a key ally in developing protocols to identify and prevent pharmaceutical manipulation of elderly patients. Her work with our foundation helped train other medical professionals to recognize signs of systematic abuse. The family members who had been excluded and manipulated by my parents became the core of a new family structure based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than financial obligation and emotional manipulation. Uncle Thomas, Great-Aunt Eleanor, and the cousins who had supported our cause formed relationships that honored my grandmother's memory while protecting against future abuse. Even Maria Santos, who had been pressured to recant her testimony, was ultimately vindicated when the recordings proved her observations had been accurate. We hired her to help manage my grandmother's former home, which I converted into a residence for elderly individuals who needed support but wanted to maintain their independence. The most profound change was in my relationship with my own identity and sense of belonging. For my entire life, I had struggled with feeling like an outsider in my family, never understanding why I could not earn their acceptance despite my efforts to be the perfect daughter and granddaughter. The investigation revealed that their rejection had nothing to do with my worth and everything to do with their need to maintain control over their criminal activities. My grandmother's recordings included several messages directed specifically to me, recorded in her final months as her condition deteriorated. Serafina, her voice said, in one particularly moving segment, "If you are hearing this, it means you found the strength to fight for the truth. You were never the problem in this family. You were the threat to their lies, and that made you the most important person in my life. Build the family you deserve, not the one you were born into." Those words became the foundation of my new understanding of family and belonging. Blood relationships that are built on manipulation and exploitation are not sacred bonds worthy of preservation. True family consists of people who choose to support, protect, and care for one another based on love and respect rather than obligation and fear. Standing in the courthouse after my parents were sentenced, surrounded by the chosen family I had built through this fight for justice, I realized that being excluded from their table had been the greatest gift they could have given me. It forced me to build my own table, one where truth was valued over comfort, justice was prioritized over family loyalty, and genuine care replaced performative obligation. The story that began with humiliation and exclusion had evolved into empowerment and justice. My family had intended to isolate and marginalize me, but instead, they had freed me to become the person my grandmother always believed I could be. Someone who would fight for truth, no matter the personal cost. Someone who would protect the vulnerable, even when it meant challenging the powerful. And someone who understood that real family is not about blood, but about choosing to love and protect one another. The table I was excluded from no longer exists, but the table I built in its place is surrounded by people who value integrity, courage, and justice. And there is always room for one more person who believes that truth and compassion matter more than convenience and conformity. Before I wrap up this story of family betrayal and ultimate justice, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where family loyalty was tested by discovering uncomfortable truths? How did you handle situations where doing the right thing meant challenging people you were supposed to love unconditionally? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your experiences matter and might help others facing similar situations. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help it reach other people who might need to hear about the power of standing up for truth. Subscribe to my channel for more stories about finding justice in family situations, and remember to hit the notification bell so you never miss new content. Share this video with anyone who has struggled with difficult family dynamics, because sometimes knowing you are not alone makes all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story and supporting this journey toward healing and justice. Remember, sometimes the family that rejects you is doing you the biggest favor of your life by forcing you to discover who you really are and what you truly deserve.